I'm Jim Csek. You're watching Kelowna Now in our ongoing coverage of the BC election, which just comes up on October 19th, the big day. This is where you get that chance to vote. And today with me, Gavin Dew of the Conservative Party.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
So let's kick it off. You're running in the Kelowna-Mission riding.
That's right, Kelowna-Mission.
A lot of rhetoric coming from both sides. Definitely a lot of attacks coming from the NDP. We're actually attacking the candidates of the Conservative Party right now. Seen a lot of stuff come out, even like something saying, hey, we got to remove these candidates. Like, obviously, less talk on policy, more on attacks. What do you think of that?
I think the reason why you have this constant, unending focus on negativity from the NDP is that their record's terrible. So what they're going to do over the next number of days and weeks is they're going to spend all of their time focusing on negativity. They're going to spend all their time focusing on culture war. They're going to spend all their time talking about anything other than their absolutely dismal record. As it stands, we've had 5 years with next to 0% private sector job growth, while government's grown by a third. We've got a $9 billion deficit. We've got a healthcare system that's in collapse. We've got lawlessness and chaos on the streets. We've got a rising cost of living, and people are really, really struggling. So, you know, what I see when I talk to folks at the doorsteps is that folks are hungry for change, and I see an NDP that is desperate to distract from what this election is about, and that's common sense change.
Seems like the NDP have opened the wallet as John Rustad came out with that tax credit, and then all of a sudden the NDP came out with something that they say it's going to be more immediate. And then I think they did it in the last election too with John Horgan when they did the $500 rent credit, and now they're talking about $1,000 for each family.
And they didn't come through with it. Here's the thing. What we have seen in this election is the NDP basically stands for nothing. So they have flip-flopped on the carbon tax. They have flip-flopped on involuntary compassionate care. Now what they're doing is, after 7 years with more than 30 tax hikes, they're talking about tax cuts. So by the end of this election, I'm pretty sure David Eby is going to be wearing a conservative baseball cap and try to convince folks that he's the conservative candidate. And again, that's because their record is terrible. They have nothing positive to run on. All they're going to do is run from their record and focus on negativity. What we want to do is offer solutions for people.
I guess one of the big questions I have is, we've had a NDP government, and we've been trying to get interviews with the Minister of Health, Adrian Dix, for a long time now, and we've been continually told he's not available. And I don't see him doing interviews with anybody. If we don't have ministers that are held accountable, it's tough for the electorate to want to see them again. What's what can we hope for from the Conservative Party? Will they be held accountable? Will they do interviews? Will they talk to the media?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, you know what, your points are really good. One, around the NDP. I do some volunteer work with Arthritis Canada. And, that organization reached out to meet with Adrian Dix, and he wouldn't. Reached out to meet with Harwinder Sandhu over in Verdun Lumby, who's the Minister of State for Seniors. You know, arthritis doesn't only affect seniors, but it affects seniors disproportionately. And she wouldn't even meet with us. So the fact that you've got cabinet ministers in this government who won't meet with crucial stakeholders to address issues that affect people in their ridings, to me, that's a real issue.
Yeah, and we've seen more closures again, ER closures. We've seen also out in Merritt this weekend, and then Oliver just recently again. It seems like this is an ongoing problem that's not being addressed, and we have a health minister that will not speak to us.
Well, let's get into that, right? So over at KGH, the other weekend, a group of doctors put out their own press release blowing the whistle on the fact that there were going to be service interruptions for pediatric emergency services because they had taken it up to the top level of the hospital and to Interior Health, and they wouldn't put the information out. So, you know, for people with kids like mine, I've got a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, there were going to be days where there was no pediatric emergency service available from 5 p.m. to 8 a.m. You know what? Kids get sick. Kids get into accidents between the hours of 5 p.m. and 8 a.m., right? So not only do you have a healthcare system that's collapsing, you've got a lack of accountability and a lack of transparency. When you talk to patients, when you talk to families that rely on our healthcare system, they're very worried. But equally, when I knock on doors, I've talked to a ton of medical professionals who work at KGH who are deeply, deeply concerned about the way that our healthcare system is being managed under this government. We've just got to do better, and that's why we have a very, very detailed plan around healthcare.
There was also doctors in Surrey that called for a change in leadership. But the NDP is putting out, and they say it over and over again, that John Rustad will cut $4 billion from healthcare.
That's a lie.
John Rustad has told me that himself, that that's a lie, but they continue to say it. Where are they getting that number from?
I don't even know where they've cooked that number up from, but the reality is, here's what they're going to do. They're going to lie, they're going to attack, they're going to smear, they're going to go negative, because this is an election they never expected. The NDP thought they were getting a cakewalk election where they were going to have a divided opposition and they were just going to merrily prance their way toward getting reelected. Now all of a sudden they're in a fight. They're being held accountable for their terrible record, for the fact that they've driven our economy into the ground, for the fact that our healthcare system is falling apart, for the fact that there's lawlessness and crime and drug addiction on our streets, and they just don't know what to do. So all they've got is lies and negativity.
One of the big things they talk about too is they say John Rustad, and this is from the Green Party too, saying that John Rustad does not give a care about the environment and the climate change, and but it seems odd that they're the ones axing the carbon tax too. They're talking about getting rid of it if it's removed at the federal level. Is there a plan for the climate and the environment with the Conservatives?
Yeah, first off, I think your point's a really good one. What you've had, Jim, is both the NDP and the BC Greens have now walked away from at least a consumer carbon tax. So that's really changed substantially. Conservatives have been clear. Climate change is real. We need to make sure that we're taking action. One of the things I always talk about is wildfires, because I get asked about climate and the environment at the door all the time. And I like to remind people that in Canada, we produce 3 times as many emissions from wildfires as we do from the entirety of human and industrial activity. In fact, last year in 2023, we produced 23% of global wildfire emissions. So there's a huge, huge environmental impact, both from a climate perspective, but also in terms of air quality and, of course, in terms of the threat that wildfires pose to our community. So we need a full court press on addressing wildfires. Part of that is shifting the balance toward a more proactive approach. We've been spending 9 times as much fighting wildfires as we do on preventing them over the last number of years. So becoming more active in terms of prevention, in terms of things like planned burns, in terms of innovating around the kinds of technology that can be used in order to help prevent wildfires, and of course, making sure we have the resources to move faster so we can put wildfires out faster and reduce the damage.
So again, the NDP and the Green Party say that John Rustad's Conservatives will not acknowledge climate change, and you just acknowledge climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. I would also say this. The NDP had a plan written for them from their own wildfire task force back in 2018, and they ignored it and canceled a pilot project for using artificial intelligence to better plot the path of wildfires. In fact, that was put in place through their agreement with the Green Party. My friend Matt Toner, who was the deputy leader of the Green Party, was very involved with that and was very disappointed at the fact that the NDP actively canceled an effort to do a better job around wildfires. So, for them to be talking about these kinds of issues and pretending that they've taken action and others haven't is just absolute malarkey. They've been asleep at the switch when it comes to wildfires and the impact on climate.
Let's talk wildfire, because wildfire is such a big, important issue here for us in central Okanagan, well, for most of BC other than the Lower Mainland. The forestry companies, I've done a lot of work with forestry, a lot of interviews with forestry. John Rustad said it's tragic, I think. Kevin Falcon, same thing. Shambles. A lot of people say, even when I interviewed David Eby, he said that there's more work to be done. The forestry industry, number 2 industry in British Columbia, on a steady decline. And then, they point to say it's all over the place, but Alberta's booming. Alberta's forest industry is doing extremely well. How does John Rustad and the Conservatives fix forestry in British Columbia?
Yeah, John's got a lot of background in forestry, and we've put out a very detailed plan around forestry that includes changes around stumpage rates. It includes changes around forest management practices. A really important component of that is a more proactive approach around forest management and around proactive burns, bringing back planned burns in order to prevent unplanned wildfires. Yeah. So you've got a whole bunch of stuff around practices. It's also about stable, predictable access to fiber, because the reality is that capital investment thrives on certainty and stability, and we don't have that here in British Columbia, whether it's in forestry or whether it's in other areas. So what you have, of course, is forestry companies investing millions and billions of dollars in other places where there is stability and certainty. The same thing can be said for the entire resource sector, for major infrastructure projects, because we have a crisis of indecision in British Columbia and in Canada that has made it harder and harder for folks to make the decision to invest on the land base here.
We have the highest stumpage rates in North America. Mm-hmm. And companies like Canfor says they can't invest in British Columbia right now. And that's why they pulled their plans to expand in Houston. They've also said that they're not part of the decision making when it comes to wildfires, that they should be a part of that solution where we talk about mitigation and building out interface areas and stuff like that. Why has forestry been ignored, and how will the Conservatives make sure forestry is part of that equation? How will you bring them to the table?
Yeah, we've got to make sure that we're listening to all stakeholders, including folks in industry. You know, one of the reasons why we have wildfires is that there's been this weird bias against planned burns where, you know, as the folks from the BC Wildlife Federation like to put it, if you plan to burn in March when you can control burns, you don't end up with the same level of uncontrolled wildfires in August. So being much more proactive, bringing industry to the table, listening to people, you know, doing what the NDP hasn't done, which is actually listen to people that have expertise, whether it be from municipal governments, whether it be from industry. You know, what we have is a very top-down, autocratic, centralized government where, you know, even relative to John Horgan, David Eby is a very, very centralized command and control premier that clearly believes that government knows best and he knows best. We need to move away from that and start actually listening to people, working with communities, working with industry.
Another issue for the Okanagan is related to tourism. Renee Merrifield, the current MLA for here, said that the Airbnb ban or changes the policy in Kelowna has hurt tourism really badly. Even Loyal Woodridge, the candidate for the NDP, said there needs to be a made in Kelowna solution. And I did the interview with David Eby, and he kind of said they would listen, but they're not going to change the policy. I also asked him point blank, because Renee has said it, that the BC Hotel Association worked and is very proud of that legislation. There's a post from the former CEO president saying that she's very proud of the work that she did in moving that legislation forward. And then there's a couple studies that came out from the BC Hotel Association saying that it's working. I did an interview just the other day, last week, with Airbnb, and they say the opposite. Will the Conservatives look at the Airbnb policies so that places like Kelowna and tourism are not hurt?
100%. We need to do that, and we need to listen to municipalities that have put forward active solutions around that. So look, when I knock on doors, this is actually an issue that comes up all the time. People know that there's been a 50% year-over-year decrease in tourism in Kelowna. That's a major issue. That is affecting employment for young people. It's affecting our, wine is a $3.75 billion industry in British Columbia. There are 70 wineries for sale right now. Our wine sector, which is a backbone of our regional economy, is really, really struggling. That's not exclusively because of short-term rental, but that is a big contributing factor. We've basically said to families who want to come to Kelowna, who want to stay as a family, who want to be together in a house, not in a number of hotel rooms, we've said, don't come here. And we've also created significant instability. When you have specific zones set out for short-term rental, and when people have made investments on the basis of the rule of law at the time, and then had the rule of law stripped out from under them, not only is that wrong, that also means that there's a huge number of people who've now had a signal that government may well come along and change the rules on them. The construction of rental housing in Canada is very dependent on retail investors. And when you start changing the rules arbitrarily and scaring away that investment, you're actually not going to have the capital base to build the rental housing that we need. So just the unintended consequences of the kinds of shotgun approaches that the NDP has taken where a scalpel is needed has been catastrophic for tourism. And there's been no discernible impact on housing affordability as well. So we're definitely going to take a look at that. We're going to work with the city on that. And importantly, we're going to work quickly on that because we need folks who are thinking about coming to Kelowna for our tourism season next year to know that they are welcome and that they can come and that short-term rental will be available for them because that's going to support the rebound in tourism that we really, really need for 2025.
The NDP have said that they've done that for housing. How does the Conservatives find a solution for housing? Housing is one of the biggest pain points, whether that's a rental or a purchase of a home. How does Conservatives help solve that problem? Yeah,
we've put out a quite detailed housing plan. One of the central aspects is what has been called the Rustad rebate. So that is basically a tax deduction against both rental or mortgage costs or strata fees. That's the largest tax cut for renters and homeowners in the history of British Columbia. That's going to be a very, very significant piece. We've also talked about substantial billion-dollar-a-year commitments to helping support the construction of infrastructure in communities. Because you know what? We really, really need to catch up in terms of infrastructure in Kelowna and elsewhere. we have serious infrastructure needs, and there's been a serious lack of investment under this NDP government. So, we need to start addressing our traffic issues. We need to start addressing our electricity issues, all of those things.
One of the things that's kind of unique, John Rustad is from rural BC, and he'd probably be one of the first premiers to be from rural BC, especially, or at least for a long, long, long time. And many people in rural, outside the Lower Mainland, will always make the argument that the rest of BC kind of is always forgotten. How is, if you look at a lot of the small towns around BC and Slocan and stuff like that, the main streets are boarded up. And there's lots of lots available in those towns. How do we incentivize people to move into those smaller communities and look after all of British Columbia as opposed to just the Lower Mainland?
Yeah, I think that's always been a challenge with the NDP, frankly. I still remember back in the 2013, 2017 election, I was doing a panel show on Global. And a person from the NDP proudly said that John Horgan was campaigning in the ridings that matter. And that, to me, was them revealing their bias, right? At the end of the day, the NDP really only cares about urban British Columbia and is pretty content to just cut loose the rest of the province.
It does kind of say that's who gets elected, because there's so much more, I guess, voting power in the Lower Mainland than there is in the rest of British Columbia, but it doesn't really help the rest of British Columbia.
There's also a tremendous economic contribution. If you look at the economic contribution on a per capita basis that comes from rural British Columbia, it's absolutely massive. Although we've urbanized as a province and although our economy continues to diversify with things like tech, we are still fundamentally at our economic base a resource-oriented province. And much of that happens in rural British Columbia, even though, if you go down Burrard Street or Howe Street in Vancouver, you've got towers and towers full of people that are serving the mining sector. They're serving the resource sector. They're benefiting from the wealth that is generated in rural British Columbia. So we do need to make sure that we have a government that's representative of the entire province, whether that be geographically or demographically. And we do need to make sure that those rural communities have the resources that they need in order to thrive, in order to be revitalized, or in order to make sure that we're cushioning the blow of change.
You're very well spoken, and you're out here and you're talking, but I can't seem to get the rest of the Conservative candidates to talk. There's a lot from the NDP that say that the John Rustad's pool is full of extremists and people that he doesn't even want to talk. Why won't they talk? And the NDP seems to want to label these candidates and also paint them as extremists and not good for British Columbia.
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of interviews from NDP candidates here either. In fact, in some cases, they didn't even have candidates until a couple of weeks ago. So I think that, the thing about elections is that every candidate, has a different set of priorities and choices in terms of what they're focusing on. Frankly, I find that knocking on the doors is one of the most effective things you can do in a campaign, because you end up meeting a lot of people that are completely different. In the span of a couple of hours, in one day of door knocking, I met a guy named Rick in Rutland who was probably, 55 or 60, has never voted in an election, and now, as a result of our conversation, is going to vote for the first time and vote Conservative. And then a couple hours later, I met someone with a master's in economics who had worked at a high level in the provincial government. You get an incredible level of engagement from being out there and knocking on doors. And that's what our candidates have been doing for months and months. So they're out there, they're talking to people, they're very comfortable talking to a wide range of people. I've done more media than the average candidate, and I'm quite comfortable doing it, obviously, Jim. So that's the role that I'm taking on here.
So they paint the Conservatives as not recognizing climate change. You just recognize climate change. Also, a lot of tinfoil hat conspiracy things and all kinds of weird things. But wouldn't we be better off if we just started talking policy on both sides?
Yeah, that'd be great. If we're talking about weird, look, crack pipe vending machines are weird. This NDP government is weird. They've done a lot of weird stuff that's been very ineffective, that's driving our economy into the ground and making our communities unsafe. That, to me, is weird. But you're right, Jim. We should be talking about policy. It's anybody who's met me or seen me do stuff like this knows I'm a pretty big geek, right? I care deeply about policy. I care deeply about business. I come from a business background. I've been involved in a lot of kind of business and economic policy conversations. And I really do wish that was what our politics could be more focused on, is solutions, evidence-based, data-driven solutions that are common sense, that are going to work for people and families. That's what gets me excited about being involved in politics. And the thing about campaigns, especially this is probably one of the more negative campaigns that's happened in the recent history of British Columbia. I'm really looking forward to being through the negativity. I'm looking forward to being through the division and being focused on trying to offer solutions and get stuff done for people here in Kelowna.
How do we start to incentivize business here? Because a lot of businesses, there's a lot of taxes that were introduced by the NDP in their 7 years, including the employer health tax, minimum
32
wage.
tax hikes, Jim. 32 tax hikes.
So it's been very tough for small businesses in BC. And it seems like there's almost an adversarial relationship between the government and small business. Should we not be incentivizing small business to take risk with capital and also employing more people?
We absolutely should be, right? So, some of that is policy and some of that is culture. I think there's been a series of policies enacted by this government, from the employer health tax to, again, those 32 tax hikes across the board that have created conditions where I know a lot of young people that are entrepreneurial, and they're arriving at the conclusion that they are just not set up for success here in British Columbia. So they're leaving and they're starting those companies in Alberta. They're starting those companies in Austin, Texas. So we need to make sure that from a policy perspective, we're making it possible for small business to succeed. But we also need to make sure that we change the culture and change the way we're talking. Because, look, I was in Alberta a couple of months ago for a venture capital summit talking about agricultural technology. You look at what's happened. A couple of months ago, a report came out showing that Alberta has eaten British Columbia's lunch and is now the third biggest jurisdiction in Canada for venture capital investment, outstripping British Columbia by more than $100 million. So you know what? Our mojo is severely, severely eroded. We need to get back that can-do attitude. We need to not only change policies so that people can be successful, but we also need to make sure that we shift the tone dramatically and we celebrate entrepreneurship. We celebrate risk-taking. We celebrate the people that are starting businesses here. We make them welcome, and we do our best to set them up for success rather than treating them like villains like the NDP. Or frankly, even if they're not treating them like villains, the hard reality is there's almost no New Democrat in the legislature who has any experience in business. So even if they try to understand, and even if they try to help business, the sheer fact that they haven't a clue what actually creates conditions for investment and business growth and success continually hamstrings them and makes it impossible for them to set up small business for success.
We just held an AI summit, and I talked to one of the leading tech people in Vancouver, and he said it's the current environment is chasing tech companies out of British Columbia.
Yes.
And how do we fix that so that British Columbia can be a hub for technology? Because it's a beautiful place to live. Yet if you have a great idea and you're gonna go do it in Silicon Valley as opposed to here, how do we keep those people here?
Yeah, so there's a variety of different pieces. One of the challenges that I hear from people that I know in tech companies over and over and over again is that the cost of living and the tax rates are creating a huge issue. Because if you're a tech company and you're trying to hire entry-level staff with the finite wages you're able to pay, especially when you're a startup, they literally cannot afford to live in British Columbia and work for you. And the affordability advantage that Kelowna used to have has been significantly reduced. At the same time, tech companies are having difficulty recruiting and retaining senior staff because the tax rates are just so high that they don't want to be based in British Columbia and paying taxes here. So you've got the tax element. Access to capital is crucial throughout British Columbia. There have been some improvements in terms of significant Silicon Valley-based capital coming into the British Columbia market, but most of the success there has been primarily in Vancouver. We need to make sure that there's more ecosystem supports for the tech sector here in Kelowna because access to capital is still a really, really huge challenge in terms of the ability to grow companies beyond that small scale friends and family capital into more institutional sources of investment.
Again, the NDP would say, and even the Green Party would say that the Conservatives are going to burn this province down and not care about the climate. You seem very progressive, would a Conservative government still consider solar and wind and all those other greener energies along with the LNG?
Yeah, we just put out a platform plank today around powering British Columbia, which talks about the whole range of different power sources. And one of the things it explicitly says is that we will look at those power sources where they make sense. What you've got to do when you're talking about alternative energy is be realistic about firm power, base load power, and be realistic about what can be achieved with different energy technologies. So rather than taking an ideological predisposition toward energy, we're going to take a very pragmatic, common sense, all options on the table approach in order to power BC.
So we're holding these 30 minutes. There's 5 minutes left, and that 5 minutes is for you. You can speak to the people.
All right, Jim. No pressure. Look, folks, this is a really, really big, important election. This is probably the most important election in British Columbia in recent memory. And what we have has been a year or a couple of years of complexity as, what we call the Free Enterprise Coalition, the Economic Coalition, the people that want to make sure that the NDP doesn't continue to drive our province into the ground. That has gone through a period of reformation, where now what's happened is the Economic Coalition has been reformed under the Conservative Party of British Columbia. We're in an election that is extremely close and is going to be extremely competitive, and probably over the next few weeks is going to be filled with negativity. And what I hope people will focus on is the choice. And that choice fundamentally comes down to more chaos and more decline and more of what we've gotten over the last 7 years under the radical NDP government, or the alternative is common sense change with John Rustad and the Conservative Party of British Columbia. That's what we're focused on offering. We're putting out policy day after day that is serious and well thought out and is robust and is designed to make sure that we can get this province back on track with common sense change. And that's where I hope people will put their focus, is looking at the range of solutions that we are offering, looking at the fact that although, we are a new political party, we've been flying an aircraft while assembling it and writing the plans. But it's incredible how quickly it's come together. It's incredible how many people have gathered around the Conservative Party of British Columbia to make sure that it is ready and robust and prepared to form a government that can do a better job than David Eby and the NDP. So I really do hope that when people make that comparison and when they sit down and prepare to mark an X on their ballots, they're deciding fundamentally between more NDP, everything that's happened. They're ignoring the fact that the NDP is now running from their record and changing their position on issue after issue after issue and dumping negativity and toxic sludge out the back of a truck all over the province to try to get people distracted from that record. And I hope that they're focused on the kinds of positive, forward-looking, common sense change that the Conservatives are offering.
So one of the things that we'd like to say is Kelowna now provides this 30 minutes so you can get to know the candidate and it's better than a clip. Lots of times you just get clipped and you don't get the full story. One of the things we do want to encourage is everybody to get out there and vote, though. If you have a young person in your family and they don't know the issues in that, you can go to Kelowna now and you can watch these 30-minute interviews with candidates. And I think the more you get to know, the more you get to hear and kind of like separate yourself from the rhetoric and understand what's in it for you, because this is your chance as a voter to ask what's in it for me, as opposed to just the name calling and the hate that's being put out there.
Yeah, you're right, Jim. One of the most powerful, moving conversations I've had in the last couple of days, I mentioned meeting Rick in Rutland, who had never voted before and was preparing to vote for the first time and vote Conservative. Just yesterday, I had the sweetest interaction with a mom and her 20-year-old daughter. And not only were they cute and funny, and not only did they make me think about the dynamic between my wife and our 6-year-old. I was looking forward 14 years on that. But it was just the sweetest conversation where they were talking about the issues. They were talking about democracy. They were asking me good questions, tough questions. And, what came away from it was this 20-year-old who was preparing to vote for her first time ever and was taking it seriously and was looking into the issues and was going to go forward. And just the pride that I saw on the face of her mother in her daughter getting involved, getting up on the issues and making a good informed decision was just so moving.
Yeah, I just want to remind people that the politicians all want to hear from you during election time. It's when they're in power, though, that they need to be held accountable, because that's part of it, right? Because they ask for the vote, and if they don't want to be held accountable, it's tough, right? So this is the part for the media. Like, they need to be able to answer the questions, and I think that if and I'm going to hold you to it, if you guys gain government, then that promise of being held accountable needs to be held.
Yeah, Jim, you can have me back anytime. And I'll say this, a lot of the time when I'm talking to folks on the doorsteps, we'll get it. Sometimes we'll get into more detailed conversations. The number of business cards I've given out with my email and my phone number and the encouragement to follow back and, to come and hold us accountable, whether we're doing the right thing or whether we're doing the wrong thing. That's something I really, really believe in. So I do hope that not just through the election, but afterward, people will continue to reach out, to engage, and to hold us to account. I don't just mean the media. I don't just mean the big institutions and businesses that already have a level of influence. I also do mean just regular everyday people reaching out and making sure that their politicians are delivering on what they said they would do.
And with that, we thank you for watching Kelowna Now, and get out there and vote.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
We don't just report the news. We live here too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us. No government funding, no outside influence. Kelowna Now, local, independent. News you can trust.